Hey everyone, and welcome back. I'm Noah Zerby, and in this video we're going to be looking at the evolution of U.S. foreign policy doctrines over time. There's a lot to unpack, so let's get to it. In foreign policy decision-making, the term grand strategy is used to focus on the highest-order questions of global politics, articulating a country's international role, aligning its means and ends, and serving as a lodestar for guiding discrete policy decisions. In this sense, it's helpful to distinguish strategy from tactics. If we think of tactics as focused on how to use resources to win the battle, then we can think of strategy as how to use battles to win the war. During the Cold War era, the U.S. grand strategy was one of containment, that is, of attempting to limit Soviet expansion without directly engaging in military conflict with it. The overall U.S. strategy of containment informed individual tactical decisions, whether to support this country or that, whether to get involved in this conflict or not. All of those decisions, at least ideally, flowed from the grand strategy. But at the end of the Cold War, the question of what U.S. grand strategy should look like, or indeed whether or not the U.S. even needed a grand strategy, became a central debate in policy circles. The debate over U.S. grand strategy centers on two broad questions. The first is the degree to which the U.S. should be involved in global affairs. Should the United States impose its will on other countries through an activist or interventionist foreign policy, or should it pursue a more restrained posture, leaving other countries and regions to sort out their own issues? The second regards the nature of U.S. involvement in global affairs. Should the United States be concerned primarily with pursuing its own national interests, or should it engage more broadly, having greater responsibility to pursue transnational interests, even if some of those have no direct effect on U.S. security or prosperity? But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's step back for a moment and consider the evolution of the various doctrines of U.S. foreign policy over time. Throughout much of the Cold War period, the various doctrines of foreign policy were really tactics that fell under the broader grand strategy of containment. First articulated in 1947, the Truman Doctrine, for example, pledged U.S. support for anti-communist movements in Western Europe. President Truman was responding to the threat posed by the communist uprisings in Greece and Turkey. As Truman described it, it must be the policy of the United States to support free peoples who are resisting subjugation by armed minorities or outside pressures. 10 years later, President Eisenhower articulated the Eisenhower Doctrine. The doctrine declared the Middle East a region vital to the interests of the United States and authorized the use of U.S. forces to secure and protect the territorial integrity and political independence of such nations, requesting such aid against overt armed aggression from any nation controlled by international communism. In the early 1960s, President Kennedy articulated the Kennedy Doctrine, which outlined a commitment to preventing the spread of communism in the Western Hemisphere. This was perhaps most clearly articulated during his 1961 inaugural address.
Let every nation know, whether it wishes us well or ill, that we shall pay any price, bear any burden, meet any hardship, support any friend, oppose any foe, to assure the survival and the success of liberty.
The 1965 Johnson Doctrine was viewed as an extension of Kennedy and Eisenhower's doctrines and asserted that the United States would view domestic revolutions aimed at establishing communist governments in the Western Hemisphere through the lens of its containment policy and would thus not permit a communist government in the Americas. After several decades of an increasingly assertive U.S. policy doctrine, the 1969 Nixon Doctrine began to retreat from the global stage, maintaining, according to Nixon, that the United States would assist in the defense and development of its allies and friends, but would not undertake the defense of all free nations in the world. In practice, this effectively meant that the United States would continue to provide a nuclear umbrella to protect its allies from the Soviet nuclear threat, but that each country would be responsible for their own security in general. The Reagan Doctrine reasserted the position of the United States on a global stage, providing that the United States would support countries fighting communism through insurgents or freedom fighters. Under the Reagan Doctrine, the U.S. dramatically expanded American support for guerrilla forces and resistance movements around the world, attempting to increase the cost of Soviet operations and reduce Soviet influence around the world. The end of the Cold War forced a dramatic rethinking of the U.S. position in the world, and questions around the scope and scale of U.S. involvement once again took center stage. The first foreign policy doctrine of the post-Cold War era, the Clinton Doctrine, identified global engagement and enlargement of democratic rule as a central goal of U.S. foreign policy. Clinton described this doctrine in a 1999 speech in the following terms.
It's easy, for example, to say that we really have no interest in who lives in this or that valley in Bosnia, or who owns a strip of brushland in the Horn of Africa, or some piece of parched earth by the Jordan River. But the true measure of our interest lies not in how small or distant these places are, or in whether we have trouble pronouncing their names. The question we must ask is, what are the consequences to our security of letting conflicts fester and spread? We cannot, indeed we should not, do everything or be everywhere. But where our values and our interests are at stake and where we can make a difference, we must be prepared to do so. And we must remember that the real challenge of foreign policy is to deal with problems before they harm our national interests.
The Bush Doctrine evolved during his presidency. Early on, Bush seemed likely to pursue a much more isolationist foreign policy than Clinton, but the September 11th terror attacks caused him to engage in a dramatic rethinking of his foreign policy vision, ultimately articulating a vision that centered on the use of unilateralism, preventive attacks on terrorist states, and establishing U.S. primacy as a key goal of grand strategy. Unlike earlier foreign policy doctrines, the Obama Doctrine was relatively ill-defined. Indeed, Hillary Clinton famously remarked that the Obama Doctrine was, "don't do stupid shit." More generously, the Obama Doctrine centered on the use of soft power, re-engagement with allies who felt alienated after Bush's unilateralism, and a reduced global military footprint. Much like his predecessor, Trump was widely criticized for the lack of a coherent foreign policy vision, largely resulting from the president's apparent quick decisions and lack of concern over protocol or history. What finally did emerge was a vision focused on an America First approach regarding war and international investment, and a transactional approach to the U.S. relationships abroad, as well as a willingness to break with longstanding American allies. Which leads to the emerging Biden Doctrine. While it's still likely too early to know exactly what the Biden Doctrine will look like, it does seem clear that Biden is seeking to restore American engagement and leadership on the global stage, most likely representing a return to the pre-Trump foreign policy doctrines. So where are we headed now? The broad framework for American grand strategy still seems relevant, and we can see how recent foreign policy doctrines might be placed into this matrix. Trump's America First doctrine involves a sharp focus on American national interests and a less active U.S. on the global stage. By contrast, Clinton's emphasis on democratization and humanitarian intervention would place his policy in the more active and more transnational camp. And Bush's willingness to engage in unilateral efforts to promote democratization abroad in the name of countering the rise of transnational terrorism would place his policy in this activist U.S. national interest quadrant. It's likely that the future of U.S. policy will center on these same broad questions, and in particular on the question of whether the United States should continue to attempt to maintain the liberal international order it helped establish after World War II, or whether we should exercise greater restraint in our engagement in global affairs. But this is a question we'll return to in other videos. That's it for now. Thanks for watching, everyone. Have a good day. Bye.